Before the story begins, one line needs to be said plainly, calmly, and on the record. What follows is a fictional investigative narrative. It is a constructed exposé designed to explore how power, family, and silence collide under pressure. It is not a claim of real events. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now we begin. The first thing people get wrong about moments like this is the noise. They expect chaos, sirens, shouting, flashing lights, a scene that announces itself as important. But the most consequential moments rarely do. They arrive quietly, almost politely, and by the time anyone realizes what has shifted, the record is already written. This story begins that way, not with a scream, or a chase, or a headline in all caps, but with a line buried halfway down a preliminary incident report. The kind of line that looks routine until you read it twice, and then a third time. And then you feel that faint, uncomfortable tightening in your chest that tells you something isn't sitting where it should. Because this wasn't supposed to be this kind of story. It was supposed to be tragic, yes. Shocking, of course, but contained. Understandable. A family devastated by violence, a suspect identified quickly, an explanation that, while horrific, allowed everyone else to exhale and say, "At least we know what happened." That's how these things usually go, but not this time. Because from the very beginning, there was an extra name hovering just outside the frame. Not in bold type, not spoken aloud at press conferences, just there, appearing in side notes, in follow-up questions, in the pauses between sentences when detectives spoke off the record. A name that didn't fit the first version of the story. And once you notice that, it becomes impossible to unsee. The house itself sits behind a gate most people will never pass through. A Brentwood address that signals arrival, permanence, safety. The kind of place where neighbors assume nothing truly bad happens, at least not without warning. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. Too normal, some would later say. No signs of forced entry that screamed intrusion. No chaotic disarray suggesting a struggle that spilled from room to room. Just stillness. Heavy. Final. 2 lives ended. A family altered permanently. When authorities spoke publicly, they spoke carefully. Measured words. No speculation. No unnecessary detail. They didn't need to dramatize what was already devastating. And then came the first arrest. It made sense. On paper, at least. Proximity. Opportunity. A narrative that aligned cleanly enough to satisfy the early questions. The media latched onto it immediately, because of course they did. Stories crave structure. Villains. Endpoints. Most people stopped listening right there. But investigators didn't. Because behind closed doors, the questions didn't stop. They multiplied. Timelines that worked, but only if you didn't look too closely. Phone records that were technically consistent, but emotionally strange. Statements that answered what was asked while carefully avoiding what wasn't. And then there was the daughter. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make accusations in front of cameras. She didn't do what people expect someone in her position to do when the worst thing imaginable has just happened. Instead, she said something much quieter, much more dangerous. She told police there was a family member they should be worried about. Not the one already in custody. Another one. At the time, that line didn't make headlines. It was treated as grief-talking, trauma-scrambling thoughts. Investigators noted it, logged it, and moved on. At least, that's what the public was told. Because here's the thing about modern investigations. What you hear and what is happening are rarely the same thing. There's the version designed to stabilize the situation. And then there's the version unfolding in conference rooms, on whiteboards, in late-night calls between people who know that if they miss something now, they don't get another chance later. And in those rooms, the story was already shifting. Quietly, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The second son wasn't living on the property. That mattered, and it didn't. He wasn't present that night. That mattered, and it didn't. He wasn't the obvious suspect. That mattered, until it didn't. Because investigations aren't built on what feels obvious. They're built on patterns, on deviations, on the small things that don't line up cleanly when everything else supposedly does. Why were certain calls placed and not returned when they were? Why did some messages stop abruptly while others continued as if nothing had happened? Why did one device move in a way that suggested awareness without presence? And maybe the most uncomfortable question of all, Why did no one seem surprised by what happened? Not shocked exactly. Just prepared in a way that's hard to articulate, but impossible to ignore once you sense it. Have you ever been in a room where everyone knows something, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud? That's what this case began to feel like. A story waiting for permission to become something else. To be clear, none of this means guilt. Not yet. Not even close. Suspicion is not proof. Association is not intent. Silence is not always complicity. But silence can still matter, especially when it stretches on, when it's strategic, when it coincides with moments where speaking up would have changed the trajectory of events. That's where this story lives. Not in bloodshed or spectacle, but in the space between knowledge and action. Between what someone knows and what they choose to do with it. The arrest that would later make headlines did not come with a dramatic press conference. No line of microphones. No victory lap statements from prosecutors. It happened almost quietly. Paperwork first. Conversations second. Movement last. And when the news finally broke, the wording was careful. Accomplice. Not killer. Not mastermind. Accomplice. A word that carries weight precisely because it refuses to tell you everything. A word that suggests proximity without clarity, awareness without full confession, a role that exists in the shadows of another act. What does it actually mean to be an accomplice? Legally, it's about assistance, facilitation, knowledge combined with action, or deliberate inaction. Morally, it's murkier. It asks a harder question. How close do you have to be to something terrible before you are responsible for it? And that's the question this story keeps circling back to. Because if the first arrest satisfied our appetite for resolution, the second one unsettled it completely. It suggested that what happened inside that house was not a single act, but a chain. Not a moment of violence, but a sequence of decisions. Some loud, some quiet, some made long before that night ever arrived. And maybe the most unsettling possibility of all is this. What if the most important moment in this story didn't happen on the night anyone died? What if it happened weeks earlier? Months earlier? In a conversation that felt ordinary at the time. In a warning that wasn't taken seriously enough. In a silence that seemed easier than confrontation. We tend to believe tragedies announce themselves in advance. That there are signs we would have recognized if only we'd been paying attention. But real life isn't that kind. Real life whispers. It leaves breadcrumbs so subtle they look like dust. And by the time you realize they formed a trail, you're already standing at the end of it. As this case moved forward, investigators began to reread everything. Texts that once seemed benign. Calls that once seemed routine. Financial documents that suddenly carried different weight depending on the date at the top. And somewhere in that process, the story stopped being about what happened that night. It became about what happened before. And who knew it. And who didn't. And who knew more than they admitted. Because once you ask those questions, you can't unask them. They follow you into every new detail. Every new revelation reframes the last one. Every answer opens a door to 3 more questions. And that's where we're headed next. Not to the crime scene, but to the timeline. Because when investigators finally laid every movement, every call, every silence out in order, something emerged that no one had expected. And once they saw it, they couldn't look away. Did the timeline make sense because it was accurate, or because everyone wanted it to? That question surfaced quietly, almost reluctantly, as investigators began laying out the first 48 hours minute by minute. Not for the public, not for headlines, just for themselves. A long table, printed call logs, security timestamps, entry records, notes scribbled in margins that said things like verify and ask again, and, occasionally, a simple underline beneath a time that seemed too neat. Too clean. The house sat behind its gate exactly as it always had. That, in itself, was part of the problem. No alarms tripped. No panicked neighbors reporting noise in the night. No obvious signs that the boundary between safety and danger had been breached in a dramatic way. If something violent had happened here, it had happened inside the margins of normalcy. And that unsettled everyone. The first responder timeline was straightforward. Arrival time logged. Entry point noted. Initial sweep conducted. Nothing about it raised red flags at first glance. It fit the story everyone expected to tell. A contained event, limited to the interior, with no need to look beyond the obvious. But investigations don't run on first glances. They run on second ones. Third ones. On the moment someone says, "Wait, go back to that." The gate log showed entries that aligned with known comings and goings. But alignment can be misleading. When you stare at data long enough, patterns appear whether they're meaningful or not. The trick is figuring out which ones matter. One entry time in particular drew attention, not because it was wrong, but because it was right in a way that felt rehearsed. The kind of right that leaves no room for human error. Have you ever looked at something and thought, "This is too tidy to be real"? That's what this felt like. Inside the house, the rooms told a quieter story. No overturned furniture. No signs of frantic movement from room to room. Whatever happened didn't unfold as a chaotic struggle that spiraled out of control. It unfolded with purpose, or at least with familiarity. The difference matters. A stranger panics. A stranger rushes. A stranger leaves traces of uncertainty behind. But someone who knows the space, someone comfortable within it, moves differently. They don't hesitate in doorways. They don't second-guess which hallway leads where. They don't leave in a hurry unless they need to. Which raises another question investigators didn't voice publicly. Why did nothing feel rushed? Time of death estimates placed the incident within a window wide enough to be frustrating, but narrow enough to rule certain things out. That window overlapped with multiple known activities, multiple devices in motion, multiple people existing in parallel timelines that were about to be compared very closely. The guest house lights came on at a recorded time that suggested normal evening routine. The main house lights told a similar story. Too similar, perhaps, as if the rhythm of the night never broke stride. And yet, somewhere in that calm, something irreversible occurred. When investigators plotted phone activity alongside physical movement, the first inconsistency appeared. Small, almost dismissible. A call placed, not answered. Another call, minutes later. Shorter, also not answered. Then silence. Not the kind that screams panic. The kind that settles in. Later, much later, a message was sent from the same device. Neutral. Ordinary. As if nothing had happened in between. That's when someone finally said it out loud. Why would anyone send that? Because context is everything. Messages don't exist in isolation. They exist in emotional sequences. And this one felt like a bridge built over something it didn't want to acknowledge. Investigators don't assume malice where confusion might explain things. But they do flag behavior that defies emotional logic, especially when that behavior aligns too conveniently with the timeline everyone wants to believe. Another detail surfaced around movement, specifically the absence of it. No cameras caught anyone leaving the property in a state of distress. No sudden departures. No erratic driving patterns. Whoever left did so calmly, or didn't leave at all. Both possibilities raised problems, because if no one left, then someone stayed. And if someone left calmly, they did so knowing no one would stop them. The gate logs were checked again, then again, cross-referenced with vehicle data. Nothing screamed inconsistency, but something whispered it. A brief delay between two recorded entries suggested the gate had remained open longer than usual. Not long enough to trigger alerts, just long enough to allow passage without interruption. An oversight? Possibly. A choice? Also possible. Here's where investigations become less about evidence and more about interpretation. Two people can look at the same data and see entirely different stories. One sees coincidence. The other sees design. The truth often lives somewhere in between. As the night's timeline expanded backward, attention shifted to earlier conversations. Not arguments. Not confrontations. Just exchanges that, in hindsight, carried more weight than they seemed to at the time. A dinner discussion that ended abruptly. A call cut short. A plan mentioned vaguely and then dropped. Nothing incriminating on its own, but layered together, they formed something like a weather pattern. Subtle shifts in pressure. A storm not yet visible, but already forming. One investigator described it this way. It felt like the night was already decided before it happened. That's not a technical term. It's a feeling. And feelings don't make it into reports unless they're backed by something solid. So they went looking for solid. Financial records showed no sudden withdrawals that would suggest a plan in motion. No frantic transfers. No last-minute scrambling. But there was a pattern of financial distance, accounts separated, expenses compartmentalized, decisions made individually rather than collectively. Again, not evidence of wrongdoing, but evidence of separation. And separation matters in family cases. It changes who knows what, who feels responsible for whom, who believes someone else will handle a problem. At some point, someone asked the question that hadn't been asked yet. Who was supposed to be there that night? Not who was there. Who was expected? Because expectation shapes behavior. If you believe someone will arrive, you might wait. If you believe someone will intervene, you might hesitate. If you believe someone else knows what's happening, you might do nothing at all. That question led to another uncomfortable realization. Multiple people believed multiple others were aware of a brewing situation. Everyone thought someone else had eyes on it. And when that happens, accountability dissolves into assumption. Security experts reviewed the layout and noted something else. The house allowed for internal movement without triggering sensors if you knew which paths to take. Certain doors, certain angles. Knowledge gained only through familiarity. Again, familiarity is not guilt, but it narrows the field. The absence of forced entry had always pointed inward rather than outward. But now it pointed inward in a more specific way, toward those who understood the rhythms of the house, who knew which creaks mattered and which didn't, who knew when alarms were armed and when they weren't. Investigators also noticed the lack of interruption. No neighbor walking a dog at the wrong moment. No delivery vehicle passing by unexpectedly. The timing threaded the needle between ordinary disturbances. Luck can explain that. So can planning. At this stage, no one was drawing conclusions. They were building questions, and the questions were starting to stack up faster than the answers. One detective summarized it in a way that stuck. If this was chaos, it was very controlled chaos. Which begs another question. Controlled by whom? The timeline, once meant to simplify the story, was now complicating it. Every attempt to close a gap opened another one. Every assumption required a qualifier. And somewhere in the middle of all this, attention drifted, not to the crime scene, but to the spaces between actions. The pauses, the delays, the moments where nothing happened when something should have. Those moments don't show up on camera. They don't leave fingerprints, but they shape outcomes just as surely as any physical act. As investigators prepared to move beyond the property and into personal devices, one realization settled heavily over the room. Whatever happened that night was not a surprise to everyone involved. Someone knew something was coming. The only question left was how much they knew, and what they chose to do with that knowledge. And when the first recovered message from earlier that week was finally read in full, it became clear that the timeline didn't just begin on the night of the deaths. It began days before, and what it revealed next would force investigators to reconsider not just the sequence of events, but the roles people played within it. Why would someone delete a message they never expected anyone else to read? That was the question hanging in the air when investigators finally recovered the thread. Not the entire conversation, just fragments. Gaps where words had once existed. Timestamps without content. Enough to suggest intent, not enough to explain it. And sometimes, that's worse. Because fragments force you to imagine the missing pieces. The message had been sent days before the night, everything unraveled. Early evening. Not late enough to suggest secrecy, not early enough to be casual. It referenced a situation without naming it. A person without naming them. A concern framed as something that could still be handled. Handled how? That word kept coming back. Handled. It showed up in notes. In paraphrased recollections. In one voicemail transcript that ended abruptly, as if the speaker realized mid-sentence that saying more would only make things worse. Investigators didn't jump to conclusions. They never do, not the good ones. They cataloged. They compared. They asked themselves the unglamorous questions that don't make headlines, but break cases open. Who deletes messages as a precaution rather than a reaction? Who assumes foresight? The second device told a parallel story. Less dramatic. More procedural. Location data that placed it miles away from the property on the night in question. Proof, at least superficially, that its owner couldn't have been physically present. And yet, the device moved in a way that suggested attention. Not distraction. Attention. It lit up at moments that aligned too closely with internal developments at the house. As if responding to events rather than initiating them. As if waiting. Waiting for what? This is where the story resists clean edges. Because distance doesn't absolve involvement, and proximity doesn't guarantee guilt. The law recognizes that. Investigators live by it. The idea of an accomplice isn't about who held what, or who stood where. It's about whether someone helped move events toward an outcome they understood, even partial. Her implication was about awareness, about danger that wasn't sudden, but accumulating. When asked later why she spoke up when she did, she reportedly said something simple. Because I didn't want this to become the story. It already had. Prosecutors moved cautiously. They knew how thin the line was between suspicion and overreach, between asking the right questions and appearing to invent a narrative after the fact. So they focused on what could be proven, who knew what and when, who communicated with whom in the critical days before, who took steps, any steps, that suggested foreknowledge. One recovered call transcript became central, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The caller raised a concern. The receiver acknowledged it. Then the conversation pivoted away, as if continuing would require acknowledging responsibility neither party wanted to claim. That pivot was everything. It suggested a mutual understanding without mutual accountability. And that's where the concept of complicity takes root, not in acts of violence, but in acts of avoidance. As legal teams prepared, the language shifted subtly, no longer about suspects and witnesses, now about roles, about degrees, about proximity to decision-making rather than physical presence. The arrest, when it came, reflected that shift. No dramatic charges, no sweeping statements, just a careful acknowledgement that assistance doesn't always look like help. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like being exactly where you planned to be when everything went wrong somewhere else. And as this case edged closer to that uncomfortable terrain, another development threatened to upend the careful pacing prosecutors had tried to maintain. Because a document, one that had never been meant to leave a private file, surfaced unexpectedly. And once it did, it reframed not just the timeline, but the trust everyone had placed in it. What that document revealed wasn't explosive on its own, but in context, it changed everything. And the people who saw it first understood immediately why it had been buried. Because if it became public, the story would no longer be about a single night. It would be about a series of decisions stretching back much further than anyone wanted to admit. And that was something no one was prepared to explain away. The document arrived quietly, almost innocuously. An internal memo, timestamped days before the incident, circulated among a handful of investigators. No one leaked it. No one intended it to be public. And yet, when it was finally opened in the secure conference room, it seemed to hum with implications louder than any alarm. It referenced actions, discussions, and plans in a language carefully neutral but unmistakably pointed. Not accusations, not conclusions, just facts. Facts that didn't line up with what everyone thought they knew. The first thing the investigators noticed was what wasn't there. Names were omitted. Details were sanitized. Yet patterns emerged like a shadow traced across a wall. The sequence of events suggested knowledge, foreknowledge, but carefully veiled. A narrative that whispered, someone knew something was coming, without ever naming who. It was the sort of document that makes you lean in, squint, read twice, and still feel like you're only glimpsing the edges of a larger picture. And in that quiet, tense moment, someone finally said it aloud. This isn't about what happened. It's about what people let happen. The memo didn't explain motive. It didn't assign blame. It simply tracked decisions, omissions, and communications. And when those pieces were lined up against phone logs, security timestamps, and prior statements, the lines began to intersect in ways no one had anticipated. A call in the late afternoon, normally unremarkable, now carried weight. A brief exchange, dismissed at the time as casual, suddenly appeared pivotal. It was not what was said, it was when, and to whom, and the immediate lack of follow-up. Timing, in this case, became as telling as words. Then there were the emails. Not sensational, not even unusual in content. A note about scheduling. A note about logistics. Yet when viewed alongside the other records, they created a lattice of proximity and awareness. Subtle, almost invisible. But patterns like this don't lie. They only withhold their meaning until you look closely enough. Investigators cross-referenced the memo with financial documents. No dramatic transactions, no sudden withdrawals. But smaller patterns surfaced, repeated account transfers, decisions made without standard approval, subtle reallocations of resources. Minor, almost imperceptible, but the kind of detail that could hint at premeditation, or at the very least, conscious awareness of a brewing problem. And then came the hardest part. Interpreting intent. Intent is slippery. It isn't a timestamp or a ledger entry. It's not a message that can be recovered from a deleted thread. Intent is inferred, pieced together from context, from behavior, from choices that align too perfectly with outcomes that later seem inevitable. For days, the team reviewed everything again, replayed the night, hour by hour. Not in a sensationalized, dramatic sense, but clinically. Every movement, every pause, every missed call, every ambiguous message. One analyst paused over a single text. It was benign, almost trivial, but the timestamp positioned it in a critical window. The tone was casual, yet the choice of words suggested acknowledgement of a situation that, at that time, hadn't yet erupted. What's striking, and what the public rarely sees, is how often trivial communication becomes critical evidence when viewed in the light of subsequent events. The meaning is retrospective. It's built on context that didn't exist when the message was sent. And yet, once the event has occurred, every prior communication is reframed. That's the nuance here. Every seemingly ordinary call, every brief exchange, every deleted or overlooked message suddenly became a piece of a much larger puzzle. Not the puzzle of what happened that night alone, but the puzzle of what could have been anticipated, prevented, or inadvertently enabled. By the third day of reviewing the memo, a pattern became undeniable. There was awareness. Not always action, not always voice. Sometimes just recognition. Recognition that something was wrong, without anyone stepping in to stop it. And that's where the legal definition of complicity starts to make sense. Because in many cases, complicity isn't about doing. It's about knowing and failing to act in a way that could have prevented the outcome. The document didn't accuse anyone. It didn't call anyone a criminal. It simply documented recognition, quiet, factual recognition. Yet recognition itself is explosive. When the team started mapping this against known movements on the night in question, the suspense deepened. The gaps in the timeline, moments where devices didn't ping, where cameras didn't record, where logs were clean, suddenly carried a new weight. Those voids weren't just missing data. They were moments where someone could have intervened, monitored, or alerted authorities. And then came another small but critical detail, a call that wasn't returned. Short, neutral in tone, misplaced, perhaps, in any other week. But here, it seemed deliberate. Deliberate because the person receiving it didn't respond, not out of negligence, but as if weighing whether to involve themselves. Investigators began reconstructing scenarios. Multiple possibilities, each with uncomfortable implications. Some innocent, some troubling, some bordering on deliberate omission. And yet, at this stage, no one could say for certain. Because evidence, like truth, can be selective. It's rarely neat, rarely total, often incomplete, fractured, ambiguous. The memo had done its quiet work. It reframed the narrative. It suggested that the incident didn't arise solely from a single night or a single decision. It hinted at a series of choices, conscious and unconscious, stretching back days, even weeks. And once that perspective took hold, the focus shifted, not just to what happened in the house, but to what each family member knew, or should have known, before that night arrived. Investigators realized they were no longer following a single line of inquiry. They were unraveling a chain of awareness, a lattice of acknowledgement and omission that threaded through multiple people, multiple interactions, multiple decisions that had seemed inconsequential in isolation. That realization reframed the entire case. It wasn't just about the events themselves. It was about context, awareness, responsibility, and the unsettling possibility that what appeared random or inevitable might have been quietly foreseen. And yet, for all this meticulous work, no one could state the full truth publicly. The narrative presented to the outside world was tidy, controlled, simple. Arrests, charges, headlines. But behind the headlines, questions multiplied. Because the memo, the calls, the deleted messages, they all hinted at an inconvenient truth, that some pieces of the puzzle existed long before anyone might have acted. And when the next piece surfaced, a previously hidden log, cross-referenced with location data and financial movements, the quiet implication became unavoidable. The story had only just begun, and what came next would pull the investigation and everyone involved into territory that no one expected and no one could prepare for. A new layer of complexity appeared when investigators turned their attention to the physical spaces, the rooms, the hallways, the silent corners where so much had happened without witnesses. Security footage, mundane at first glance, revealed micromovements, subtle shifts of light, a shadow lingering longer than it should have, the creak of a floorboard in a corridor that wasn't supposed to be used at that hour. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, but enough to suggest someone had moved with purpose, knowing exactly where to place each step. It's easy to overlook these things. Too often, crime scenes are thought of in terms of big, visible signs. A door kicked open, a vase smashed, glass shattered. But real stories, especially ones involving people who know the terrain intimately, unfold in subtler ways. Small details that only a trained eye or a familiar mind can perceive. And this was a familiar mind. Not just familiar with the architecture, but with routines. Who wakes when, who checks messages when, who is expected to enter a room at a specific time. All of it recorded, all of it observed, and most of it completely unremarkable to anyone looking casually. Yet, in retrospect, the patterns were anything but ordinary. Investigators mapped it out in layers. Movement, communication, financial interactions, conversations. Each thread alone was innocuous. Together, they formed a lattice of near predictability. That lattice suggested foresight, planning, or at least an awareness beyond what had been publicly acknowledged. And that's where the first moral ambiguity arose. Because familiarity isn't necessarily guilt. Knowing the layout doesn't automatically make someone culpable, but awareness creates a spectrum. A spectrum between intervention and passive observation, between participation and omission. It was on that spectrum that investigators began focusing on the subtler actors, those who were not immediately visible, not the ones already detained, but those hovering at the edges, peripheral yet pivotal. One officer described it as watching the ripples from a stone you never saw thrown. The stone lands, the waves spread, and you realize that the force was never obvious at the center. It was around the edges all along. It was in those ripples that the second son's name resurfaced repeatedly, not because of any overt action, but because of proximity, knowledge, observation, and moments where decisions could have altered the outcome. Financial patterns reinforced this. Nothing criminal in isolation. Transfers made according to long-established routines. Payments for utilities, staff, and maintenance. Small adjustments that, when aligned with movement and communication, suggested an understanding of who was where and what was expected of them. Then came another revelation. Investigators uncovered a set of recordings, brief, impersonal, almost forgettable, of conversations that occurred in the days leading up to the incident. They weren't heated. No threats, no shouting. Just discussions about scheduling, minor disagreements over household logistics, and casual acknowledgments that certain events were approaching. Yet, listened to in sequence, the tone shifted imperceptibly. A caution, a pause that seemed longer than natural, a phrase left hanging. It wasn't overtly sinister, but when paired with timing, presence, and omission, it became unnervingly suggestive. It was these pauses that highlighted the tension, awareness without declaration, observation without action, decisions deferred, responsibilities unclaimed. And then there was the daughter. Her role had always seemed straightforward, a witness, a grieving child. But her statements, scrutinized alongside these movements and communications, painted a different picture. Subtle warnings, concerns quietly voiced, implications about a family member that investigators initially thought were vague or emotionally charged. Vague they may have seemed at first. But when layered with digital footprints, financial transfers, and physical presence, or absence, they gained a clarity that no casual observer would have expected. Investigators began to see the first outlines of complicity not as a moment, but as a pattern, and that realization forced a shift in strategy. Investigators moved beyond the immediate crime scene, beyond the overtly culpable actors. They started mapping relationships, how knowledge traveled between family members, how decisions were deferred, how silence could serve as a tool, consciously or unconsciously. What made this investigation different from others wasn't the crime itself. It was the way the crime interacted with awareness and omission. The way subtle choices, the kind people dismiss as inconsequential, became central to understanding what had occurred. And within that complexity, one element stood out more than any other: control. Who controlled information? Who controlled presence? Who controlled narrative? Control isn't always about authority. Often, it's about knowledge, the quiet kind, the kind that lets you anticipate outcomes without forcing your hand. And when used strategically, it can protect or it can endanger. By the time the team was 6 days into reconstructing these events, it was clear that the narrative everyone thought they understood, of a sudden, isolated tragedy, was incomplete. The tragedy was real, yes. Devastating, undeniable. But the story was far more intricate, far more layered than the public record suggested. And that's when the first pressure point emerged. A small discrepancy between two timelines, a window of 20 minutes, showed movement that contradicted statements made in the initial interviews. Not dramatic, not outright deception, but enough to force a second look. Investigators paused, rechecked security logs, cross-referenced phone data, replayed call recordings. The more they scrutinized, the more patterns emerged. Not obvious at first glance, not dramatic, but persistent. And in that persistence lay the unease, that someone had seen, known, or anticipated more than they revealed. Because in family tragedies like this, it's rarely about a single night, rarely about a single choice. It's about the accumulation of decisions over time, small moments that seem insignificant until viewed through the lens of catastrophe. And as investigators prepared to examine the next set of data, communications, locations, and subtle financial cues, it became clear that what they were about to uncover would challenge every assumption made so far. The story wasn't just about a night of violence. It was about preparation, awareness, observation, and perhaps most unsettlingly, about what people choose to do or not do when confronted with warning signs. The implications of what came next would ripple outward, not just in the legal investigation, but in how everyone involved would have to confront their own awareness and responsibility. And once that realization hit, there was no turning back. The next revelation arrived not in the form of a call or a message, but in patterns that only became visible once you looked for them. A series of minor actions that, individually, seemed inconsequential. Checking a room, adjusting a schedule, noting who would arrive when, began to suggest forethought. Intentionality, almost invisible in isolation, became undeniable in aggregation. Investigators began reconstructing every single movement within the house over the week leading up to the incident. Entries, exits, lighting patterns, even the activation of smart devices, all were mapped meticulously. On their own, each seemed mundane. A hallway light turning on and off, a door opening quietly, a call to a service provider. Yet aligned with other events, they hinted at awareness. Planning, a sequence of decisions that, knowingly or unknowingly, contributed to the eventual outcome. It wasn't chaos that characterized these days. It was rhythm, routine, familiarity that gave people an unspoken sense of control. And with control comes responsibility, or at least, the expectation of it. That's what investigators started to realize. The event itself, the violence, the tragedy, did not happen in isolation. It was the culmination of small, almost invisible actions, choices made over time, each one tipping the scales slightly in one direction. Not everyone acted. Not everyone spoke. Some observed. Some stayed away. Some assumed someone else would intervene. And here's the subtlety that made the case so complex. These decisions were perfectly defensible on the surface. A delay in response. A message left unread. A door left unlocked. None of it seemed malicious. None of it screamed culpability. And yet, when pieced together, it created a lattice of proximity and awareness, a web that investigators had to navigate with extreme care. Financial records further complicated the picture. Nothing shocking, no dramatic transfers, no unusual withdrawals. Just small, deliberate reallocations of money. Minor transactions that suggested planning, not panic. Foresight, not desperation. Again, harmless in isolation, but when juxtaposed against movement patterns and communications, they hinted at an understanding of circumstances that went beyond ordinary observation. Investigators then began examining call logs in meticulous detail. Every call, every text, every voicemail timestamped and mapped against physical movements within the estate. Here, inconsistencies emerged. Calls made and not returned. Messages deleted. Conversations cut off mid-thought. Ordinarily mundane interactions suddenly carried weight. They implied decision-making, awareness, and possibly an intent to avoid confrontation. And then there was the daughter's involvement. She had initially seemed a peripheral witness, a grieving family member who had stumbled upon tragedy. But her statements, especially when cross-referenced with patterns in communication and movement, suggested that she had recognized early warning signs, signs that went unheeded by others. Her observations were precise, not emotional exaggerations. She identified a potential risk in a way that would later guide investigators' attention to areas previously overlooked. All of this began to paint a picture not of impulsive violence, but of a network of awareing. As the investigation delved deeper, previously hidden documents surfaced. Internal memos, emails, and logs that hadn't been included in initial reports revealed layers of awareness previously unrecognized. The subtle references to scheduling, coordination, and acknowledgement of upcoming events painted a clearer picture of who knew what and when. Yet, even as clarity increased, uncertainty remained. Intent is notoriously difficult to prove. Actions may align, but they do not automatically imply malice or direct participation. What they do suggest, however, is presence, proximity of mind, if not of body, awareness, if not action. And that awareness was precisely the thread investigators began to pull. They reconstructed not just events, but relationships, how information flowed, how decisions were deferred, and how responsibility was interpreted or ignored. Each thread revealed gaps, inconsistencies, and moments where intervention could have changed the outcome entirely. But gaps are tricky. They are spaces where inference begins, where assumption creeps in, where investigators must be careful, because drawing conclusions too early risks distortion, yet waiting too long risks missing critical connections. By this stage, the pattern was undeniable. It wasn't just the night itself that mattered. It was the accumulation of small choices, of moments when awareness existed without action. Each minor omission stacked upon the next until the event, when it occurred, seemed almost inevitable, not in a deterministic sense, but in the way that tragedy often feels inevitable once all its contributing factors are aligned. And yet, even with this understanding, investigators were still missing one final piece. One pivotal insight that would clarify the degree of involvement and the extent of foresight present before the event unfolded. That piece, they realized, could alter everything, not just for the investigation, but for how each family member's role was interpreted in the broader narrative of the tragedy. Because what they were discovering wasn't simply about actions or inactions. It was about knowledge, choice, and the consequences of both. And that is where the investigation was about to pivot. The next breakthrough didn't come from a loud discovery. It came in the quietest possible way, a detail so small it had been overlooked in every prior review. A single security log, noting movement in a hallway between two rooms, timestamped precisely during a period previously thought to be uneventful. The movement was brief, no more than 30 seconds, but it indicated presence, awareness, and observation at a time when investigators had assumed no one was nearby. What made it significant wasn't the act itself. It was who had the knowledge to be in that hallway at exactly that time. The person wasn't accounted for in prior witness statements, nor was their device showing location in a conventional sense. But the log suggested physical proximity, a gap between recorded movement and reported presence. And that's when investigators began to realize the second son, the one initially considered peripheral, might not have been merely absent from the scene. He might have been observing, watching, understanding, without intervention. It's an uncomfortable realization. Observation without action is not inherently criminal. But in the context of a developing tragedy, the law treats awareness differently. The line between passive knowledge and active participation is thin, but it exists. And the more evidence that's stacked against mere happenstance, the thinner that line became. Cross-referencing this with digital evidence revealed a pattern that was hard to ignore. Short messages sent and deleted. calls acknowledged but unanswered, slight adjustments in schedule communicated cryptically among household members. Every small action seemed designed to maintain normalcy, even as underlying tension grew. At this point, the investigation began to feel like studying a quiet storm. On the surface, everything appeared calm. The estate operated according to routine. Devices pinged, lights turned on and off, meals were prepared, rooms tidied. Yet underneath, there was subtle movement, preparation, observation, unspoken understanding. Small actions, barely noticeable, stacked upon each other, creating a web of awareness and inaction. The daughter's earlier statement now took on a new weight. Her description of a dangerous family member had been interpreted initially as vague, an emotional reaction to grief. But in combination with the hallway log, the communication patterns, and the timing discrepancies, it became chillingly specific. Someone had knowledge and had chosen to exercise restraint, or at least maintain distance, during critical moments. And then financial records entered the picture. Again, nothing extreme. No withdrawals, no transfers that screamed malintent. Just careful, deliberate, routine management of accounts. But when aligned with the other data, they painted a picture of someone aware of unfolding circumstances and positioning themselves to avoid direct involvement while still monitoring outcomes. Legal teams now began grappling with how to frame this. Evidence of awareness is subtle, often circumstantial, and easily misinterpreted. But it is precisely this subtlety that can define complicity. Knowing something is happening, understanding its potential consequences, and failing to act can carry as much weight as a physical intervention, or lack thereof. Investigators also began re-examining previously collected statements. Minor contradictions, moments of hesitation, subtle phrasing choices, all suddenly seemed significant. A phrase like, "I thought someone else was handling it," now suggested conscious deferral. A pause before answering a question took on new meaning. Ordinary hesitation became evidence of selective engagement, of partial acknowledgement. And the further they dug, the more the narrative shifted from a single night of violence to a series of escalating decisions. Each person's role, previously considered peripheral or secondary, had to be reinterpreted in light of these new insights. What looked like absence might have been intentional positioning. What looked like silence might have been a form of observation or even subtle influence over unfolding events. By the end of this phase, investigators had constructed a lattice of presence, awareness, and omission. Physical logs, digital communications, financial behaviors, and human statements all intersected. It didn't prove motive in the traditional sense. It didn't point conclusively to action, but it revealed a network of knowledge and potential influence. An invisible architecture underpinning the tragedy. And that's when the most unsettling realization emerged. The night of the incident was not the beginning. It was the culmination. Weeks, even months, of choices, observations, and calculated inactions had stacked silently, each contributing to the inevitability of what occurred. The final challenge, proving intent or complicity without overt acts. How do you demonstrate responsibility when so much occurred in shadows, in omissions, in silences? How do you hold someone accountable for what they knew and didn't prevent, without stretching into speculation? That question would dominate the next stage of the investigation. Every action, or inaction, was being scrutinized not just for what it did, but for what it allowed to happen. And as legal teams prepared their next moves, they realized that this case was no longer simply about evidence from the night of the incident. It was about patterns, timing, decisions, and the ethical weight of observation. And just when it seemed the investigators had begun to map the full scope of awareness and responsibility, a new set of documents appeared, one that contradicted several previously established timelines. It was subtle at first, a notation buried in a ledger, a footnote in a report, a date that didn't match the events as reconstructed. But discrepancies like this don't stay subtle for long. They demand attention. They force questions. And in this case, they threatened to upend everything the investigators thought they had pieced together. The stage was set for the next revelation, a twist that no one had anticipated, and one that would bring the investigation closer to the core of the family's hidden dynamics than ever before. The discrepancy wasn't dramatic in isolation. A small footnote in a ledger, a misaligned date, A minor note scribbled on a printout. Nothing that would make headlines. Nothing that, on its own, screamed significance. But in the context of everything else, the hallway log, the deleted messages, the subtle financial maneuvers, it rang like a bell. Investigators immediately zeroed in. The date suggested that an action, previously assumed to have occurred after the critical night, actually took place days earlier. A seemingly minor interaction between family members, previously dismissed as routine, now gained new gravity. Timing, as always, was everything. And this timing reshaped the interpretation of every action that followed. Why had it been recorded incorrectly or overlooked? Perhaps human error. Perhaps deliberate obfuscation. Either possibility raised questions. Every assumption investigators had made about the sequence of events now required re-examination. They began tracing the chain of awareness again. Who knew what and when? How did information move within the household? Who acted? Who deferred? Who remained silent? The answer wasn't simple. The web was messy, filled with overlapping knowledge, conflicting accounts, and intentional gaps. A conversation reconstructed from a voicemail shed new light. It was brief, casual in tone, and originally thought irrelevant. But the context was key. The sender referenced a concern that had been raised before the event. The recipient acknowledged it, not dismissively, but in a way that suggested understanding without commitment. Understanding without commitment. That became the recurring theme. People knew, they recognized risk, and they made conscious choices to act or not act. Silence, hesitation, deferral, all became forms of influence. Actions not taken were now being interpreted as meaningful. Investigators expanded the lens further. They examined peripheral communication, emails, scheduling notes, minor directives to household staff. Nothing nefarious. No direct instructions. But patterns emerged. Coordinated movements, acknowledgments of upcoming activities, subtle signals of awareness. All of it consistent with someone following events without directly intervening. And yet, intent remained elusive. Awareness alone does not prove culpability. Observing an unfolding situation does not automatically equate to responsibility. But in the legal framework, omission, especially when paired with knowledge, can carry serious weight. The investigator's task was to separate benign neglect from calculated inaction. The daughter's observations became more critical as well. Her previous comments, initially interpreted through the lens of grief, were revisited in light of this timeline correction. She had noticed tension, subtle cues, and a family member's unusual distance. Her concerns, previously thought peripheral, now appeared prescient. Investigators began layering these observations with movement and communication patterns. The result was a lattice of knowledge and decision points, showing multiple opportunities where intervention could have altered the outcome. And yet, intervention had not occurred. Financial records offered further nuance. Nothing in isolation was remarkable. No sudden transactions. No large withdrawals. But small reallocations, shifts in responsibility, and minor adjustments hinted at awareness of upcoming events. These patterns, combined with other behaviors, suggested careful positioning, an avoidance of direct involvement while remaining informed. This subtle choreography, watching, anticipating, stepping aside, was becoming the central focus. It raised uncomfortable questions about responsibility and complicity. How much awareness constitutes obligation? When does passive knowledge cross the threshold into legal significance? And how can investigators prove intent without explicit action? Investigators had to reconstruct not only the events of the night, but the decisions leading up to it. Days, even weeks, of minor choices, interactions, and omissions now mattered. Each one, when aligned, created conditions in which the tragedy became almost inevitable. And then came another detail. An email, buried in routine correspondence, indicating that one family member had anticipated a potential problem. The note was cautious, neutral, not alarming on its own. But coupled with the corrected timeline, it suggested that someone had foreseen complications, acknowledged them privately, and yet allowed the situation to unfold. This discovery forced a re-evaluation of the previous arrests. The second son, once considered peripheral, now appeared to have a degree of situational awareness previously unacknowledged. Not direct action, not overt interference, but presence in the chain of knowledge. Awareness without intervention. And awareness, in this case, was becoming as important as any physical act. Investigators realized they were no longer reconstructing a single night. They were tracing a network of awareness, decisions, and non-actions that spanned weeks. Each moment, small or seemingly trivial, became a thread in a larger tapestry. The legal implications were profound. Complicity was not just about doing, it was about allowing. Choosing not to act, knowing what could happen, positioned someone within a gray area of responsibility. And the gray area was expanding with every new piece of evidence. Just when it seemed that the patterns were becoming clear, another anomaly appeared. Another minor timing issue, this one in a set of internal logs. It contradicted statements previously accepted as factual. It suggested a movement, or lack thereof, inconsistent with prior assumptions. Investigators paused, reviewed, cross-referenced, replayed call logs, compared with financial and digital records. And as they did, the picture shifted again. The web of knowledge, awareness, and omission had deeper layers than anyone anticipated. And buried within those layers were questions that no one had yet dared to ask aloud. Who truly knew? Who consciously chose to step aside? And who recognized the potential for tragedy but did nothing to intervene? The investigation was no longer about a single night. It was about the accumulation of decisions over time. Awareness, inaction, anticipation, all converging toward an outcome that was now unavoidable. And the next revelation, one that would challenge everything assumed about roles, responsibility, and intent, was waiting just beneath the surface, ready to emerge from documents that had been overlooked until now. The overlooked documents were mundane at first glance. Meeting notes, internal memos, a series of brief, bureaucratic entries that no one outside the investigation would have ever noticed. But investigators knew better. In cases like this, the smallest notations often carried the heaviest implications. Every recorded detail, however trivial it seemed, could hint at awareness, premeditation, or the presence of knowledge someone hoped would remain invisible. The first memo in question detailed a routine scheduling discussion for the week leading up to the incident. Nothing dramatic. No threats. No arguments. Just the assignment of responsibilities, the confirmation of who would be where at what time, and reminders about minor household obligations. Yet, when layered against the corrected timeline, these entries took on a completely different weight. A line as innocuous as "ensure that evening coverage is maintained" suddenly raised questions. Who was responsible for coverage? Was coverage truly maintained? Or was this acknowledgement of responsibility paired with an understanding of what could happen if someone failed to act? It became clear that several family members, including the second son, had been privy to knowledge of the house's routines, movements, and potential vulnerabilities. Not evidence of action, yet. Not evidence of direct interference. But knowledge, awareness, and in combination with inaction, awareness became critical. Investigators began cross-referencing these memos with security logs, device pings, and call records. They noticed small discrepancies. A device pinging near the property at a time it shouldn't have been, a brief motion sensor activation that didn't correspond with known movement, a voicemail received and left unreturned. None of these were dramatic on their own, but together, they painted a pattern of observation without intervention. Then came the digital communications. Deleted messages, fragmented threads, and short, neutral emails that, when analyzed sequentially, suggested a level of premeditated awareness. Someone had knowledge of potential outcomes, yet no one explicitly warned anyone. No one intervened. The question investigators were forced to confront was stark. How much knowledge without action becomes complicity? Financial records reinforced the pattern. No large withdrawals. No sudden transfers. But minor, deliberate adjustments suggested preparation and positioning. The movements weren't overtly suspicious. They weren't dramatic. They were routine. And that was precisely the problem. Routine masked intent. Routine hid awareness. Routine created plausible deniability. Investigators then revisited witness statements. Phrases that had seemed inconsequential became meaningful. "I thought someone else was handling it," now implied conscious deferral. Pauses and hesitations, previously ignored, were noted. The small acknowledgement of risk without any corrective action became a recurring theme. The daughter's testimony, too, gained significance. Her early mention of a dangerous family member now aligned with the patterns of movement, communication, and financial positioning. She hadn't been making a guess. She had observed, and her observations, combined with digital and physical evidence, began to form a lattice of awareness that extended beyond the night itself. It was becoming increasingly clear that the narrative of a sudden, isolated tragedy was insufficient. The event was the culmination of weeks of decisions, of observations, and of choices to remain passive at key moments. The incident was not a spontaneous eruption. It was the endpoint of a chain of small but consequential acts, or omissions. And as the investigation proceeded, every small action, an email sent, a device pinged, a hallway crossed, was now scrutinized, not as independent events, but as components of a pattern. Who knew, who observed, who deferred, and who made the conscious choice not to act? This reframing brought an uncomfortable realization. The second son, once considered peripheral, now appeared central, not as a perpetrator, but as a participant in the network of knowledge. Awareness, inaction, and timing positioned him at the core of a series of decisions that indirectly contributed to the outcome. Yet, proving intent remained the challenge. Knowledge without direct action is difficult to quantify legally, but ethically and strategically for investigators, it was impossible to ignore. How much does awareness impose responsibility? When does passive observation cross the line into complicity? These were the questions that began to dominate discussions. And then, the final piece emerged, another set of memos, overlooked until now, which directly contradicted previously accepted sequences of events. A notation showing a movement, or lack thereof, inconsistent.